inside the book of Genesis. This video is going to be breaking down some of the metaphorical and symbolic teachings here in the book of Genesis. This comes from the life study of the book of Genesis by Brother Witness Lee. So first, I want to talk about how Lee breaks down the book of Genesis into three sections and how the author covers three distinct periods in the book of Genesis. Genesis can be unpacked as a movement from creation to corruption to the beginning of God's redemptive calling. So the first section of Genesis is broken down as God's purpose and sort of like the motivation behind creation and God's purpose. The second section is about the fall of man, Satan's temptation of the human race, and man's fall. The third section is about the calling of God. So it says Genesis can be unpacked as a movement from creation to corruption to the beginning of God's redemptive calling. In the first movement, creation reveals God's eternal purpose. Genesis 1 is not just about how the world began, it is about what the world was for. God creates order out of chaos, fills what is empty, and then creates man and women in his image. That means humanity was made to express God, represent his rule, reflect his character, and live in communion with him. So when the world was created, essentially, the intent was that for God to communion with man in the world, the place of the sort of like the environment of earth being a habitat for man communing with the Lord. Okay. That means humanity was made to express God, represent his rule, reflect his character, and live in communion with him. Humanity was not created merely to exist, work, or survive, but to be a living reflection of the invisible God on the earth. In Eden, you see the original pattern: God near to man, man unashamed before God, creation in harmony, identity before performance, and purpose flowing from relationship. So Genesis 1 shows that God's intention was always presence, likeness, fruitfulness, dominion, and fellowship. This is before, men convincing themselves that he has to work hard, he has to perform, he has to produce in order to be loved. There was already unconditional positive regard and unconditional love bestowed upon man, evidenced by Eden providing all of the food, all of the resources, everything man needed without necessarily having to perform for it. Then Genesis 3 introduces the second movement, corruption. Again, Satan moves fast. He wants us to react impulsively. A lot of decisions that are made quick, impulsively, irrationally tend to be the decisions that come with the greatest consequence. Before creation has even had a chance to really fully blossom, Satan is already on the scene here. So Genesis chapter 3 introduces the second movement, corruption. The fall is not just Adam and Eve making a bad decision. It is humanity choosing autonomy over communion, self-definition over trust, and independence over surrender. Sin fractures everything. Their relationship with God is broken. Their relationship with each other is damaged, and even their relationship with themselves is altered through shame, fear, and hiding. The earth is still God's by ownership, but in terms of human experience, his rule is resisted and his presence is no longer welcomed in the same way. That is why it's powerful in that the human race is rebelling against God. However, God is still offering opportunities of grace, love, and calling upon his people here. So what makes Genesis so deep is that corruption does not cancel purpose. Even after the fall, God begins moving towards calling. He seeks Adam in the garden, covers shame, judges evil, and then later calls Abraham. That means Genesis is not only the story of what man lost, it is the story of what God refuses to abandon. Creation shows God's purpose. Corruption shows man's rebellion. Calling shows God's answer. He begins to recover a people through whom his original intention can move forward again. So the earthly chapters of Genesis are not random stories. They are the blueprint of the whole Bible. God creates for fellowship, man falls through rebellion, and God begins a redemptive mission to restore his purpose on the earth. So here we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So again, this is from the life study of the Bible, the book of Genesis from Witness Lee. Here he talks about how Abraham and Isaac and Jacob represent sort of like these three different stages of being chosen. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not just three separate patriarchs in history. They portray three stages of aspects of one complete spiritual experience in God's chosen people. He says they represent three aspects of one spiritual man. In another place, he connects them to God's work in the believer as calling, enjoyment of grace, and transformation. Abraham, the called one, so Abraham represents God's calling. In Witness Lee's thought, Abraham shows the believer being called out of the old world, separated unto God, justified by faith, and learning to live by faith rather than by natural security. So this is sort of like the beginning stages of a believer being called. We're naturally called out of our old habitat. Sometimes you may have to relocate. You might have to change environments. You know, when God calls you out of a past that's misaligned with his intentions, you may have to remove yourself from your family, your friends, and your old way of living. So Abraham sort of represents that first stage of all believers' sort of spiritual life and their relationship with the Lord. So Abraham shows the believer being called out of the old world, separated unto God, justified by faith, and learning to live by faith rather than by natural security. Abraham's life is marked by the altar and the tent. The altar signifies consecration and fellowship with God, and the tent signifies a pilgrim life on earth, not just settling into the world system. So Abraham is constantly moving. Some believers might find themselves constantly shifting, constantly having to relocate, constantly having, because we live in a sinful world. And in these times, we're living in a very polarized, sort of radical humanity where people have really, really polarizing beliefs. So for believers, you might find yourself having to switch jobs a lot, relocate, move around a lot, because that signifies sort of like that first stage of the call. And it says here, so Abraham is the stage where a person begins with God through divine calling, faith, obedience, and a clear break from the old source of identity. Isaac, the one who receives and enjoys the inheritance. Okay. So Isaac represents the enjoyment of grace and inheritance. If Abraham shows the beginning of the journey, Isaac shows the life that receives what God has promised. Isaac did not strive the way Abraham did. He mainly inherited, received, and enjoyed. Witness Lee presents Isaac as a picture of the believer enjoying God's provision. So now you go from the stage of the called. Now you're receiving grace on your life, right? Favor, you're prosperous, okay? And you're enjoying sort of like the fruits of that salvation. So here it says here, as a picture of the believer enjoying God's provision, promise, and rest as a son. This stage emphasizes sonship, grace, and the peaceful enjoyment of what God has accomplished rather than human struggle to produce something for God. In that sense, Isaac is the stage of learning to live from what God gives, not merely from what you can build. And you see this a lot with the descendants of Esau, how they built communities, they built civilization, they were engineers, but you didn't see really any reverence or reference to them building this community for the Lord. Witness Lee talks about how early on in Genesis, how man would create community as a false sense of security. Community was a way for them to protect themselves. We have weapons, we have swords, we have all this different, we have walls, right? It was like a false sense of protection that they did not necessarily have based off of their sort of distance from the Lord. Um, so I love how he broke that down. So again, with Isaac, this stage emphasizes sonship, grace, and peaceful enjoyment of what God has accomplished rather than human struggle to produce something for God. In that sense, Isaac is the stage of learning to live from what God gives, not merely from what you can build. In Jacob, the chosen one who is transformed, Jacob represents the chosen person who must be dealt with, broken, and transformed. Witness Lee is especially strong here. Jacob begins as a natural, clever, striving man, but through many trials, God gradually reshapes him, right? You can remember Jacob, he's wrestling with the Lord, right? I won't leave until you bless me, right? And Witness Lee talks a lot about how that's how kind of God deals with us, right? When we're really entrenched in that sin and we get really stubborn, right? We put up a fight for the Lord, okay? And that's when the Lord sort of taps his hip out of its socket, and now he's sort of handicapped, okay? So that's how God deals with us. Sometimes we're wrestling with God. He's trying to lead us to salvation. We want to stick with that old world. We want to stick with our own program. So Jacob, the one who is chosen and then transformed. Witness Lee is especially strong here. Jacob begins as a natural, clever, striving man, but through many trials, God gradually reshapes him. Both him and Abraham had their name changed. And here in Genesis, he explicitly describes Jacob's experience as involving being chosen, dealt with, broken, and matured. The point is that calling and inheritance are not the end. The natural man must be transformed. Jacob eventually becomes Israel, a prince of God, and then a mature person able to bless others. So Jacob is the stage where God works deeply through circumstances to remove self-reliance and produce maturity. So the three stages here, because you hear a lot of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham is the called out phase, Isaac receiving and enjoying, Jacob being transformed through God's dealing. So the progression is God calls you, brings you into the enjoyment of his promise, and then transforms you until you become mature enough to express him and bless others. All right. And Abraham was called a couple of times. So it says here, Abraham's calling can be understood in two stages of divine separation. All right. In Genesis 12:1, God says, "Now the Lord has said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house." All right. This was the second calling. But in the initial one, in Acts 7:2-4, Stephen gives important commentary. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dealt with Charan and said unto him, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred. All right. So there's two different callings here. Initially, God calls Abraham out of his country and from his kindred. All right. However, Abraham still clung to his father, his family, and then eventually he loses his father. All right. And then God reemphasizes again in Genesis 11:31. All right. Or Genesis 12:1. Give, thee out of thy country, thy kindred, and from thy father's house. All right. So I'm going to be doing some more breakdowns on the book of Genesis, but just kind of wanted to introduce some different alternative ways here to look at this. Hope you guys have a blessed day. I'm out.